Good evening, members, and welcome to this 13th virtual CPA meeting. Before we start the session, I would request everyone to rise for the Institute mottos followed with Code of Ethics.
य एष सुप्तेषु जाग्रति य एष सुप्तेषु जाग्रति कामं 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 कामपुरुषो पुरुषो निर्मिमाणः तदेव शुक्रं तद्ब्रह्मा तस्मिन् लोकः सर्वे तदूनात्यपि कश्चन एतद्वैता 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 एतद्वैता
Thank you, members. Earlier this week, we had a session on important and recent judgments under GST law. Today, we have a session on important and recent judgments on under income tax laws. We have with us Advocate Harsh Rajesh Kothari with us to take us through this judgment. I would request Pratik Maru to formally introduce today's speaker.
Thanks, Deepen. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to introduce today's speaker. Harsh Kothari practices as an advocate. He is also a chartered accountant and a company secretary. He stood 24th All India in final CS exams and has also secured highest marks in paper corporate restructuring and insolvency in final CS exams. He works in the chamber of Mr. S.E. Dastur, senior advocate. Harsh has specialized in the litigation in the field of income tax, international tax and transfer pricing, and he has been regularly appearing in High Court, ITAT, and Commissioner Appeals. Prior to joining the Stoor's Chambers, he has been working with EY in tax knowledge and solution team headed by Mr. Pinakin Desai. With this brief introduction, I welcome today's speaker, Harsh Kothari. I would like to mention that BCSC gives a contribution of 500 to CABF fund on speaker's behalf as a token of appreciation for this webinar. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Maru. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to come and speak at the Borivali Central Study Circle. Because of these circumstances, we are having this online meeting, which I think is a very good initiative by the conveners of the study circle. And let's start with the presentation. So I've put in some of the relevant and important decisions in the income tax which have come recently, and I will be taking you through all of them. So the first decision which we will look at is the decision of the Mumbai Tribunal in the case of Sofina. Now, as we are all aware, after Vodafone's decision by the Supreme Court, several amendments were made by the Finance Act 2012. One of the amendments was in connection with Explanation 5, which was inserted in Section 911. Now, Explanation 5 said that any capital asset, being any share or interest in a company or an entity which is registered or incorporated outside India, shall be deemed to have been situated in India if the share or interest derives its value substantially from the assets in India. Now, this is a case which revolves around Explanation 5 to Section 911. Now, let us look at the facts of this particular case. Now, this was a case where the assessee was a venture capital investor. The assessee was a tax resident of Belgium and had made investments in several companies across the world. Now, one of the investments which the assessee had was 11.34% preference shares in a Singapore company, Achilles Pte Limited. Now, this Singapore company in turn had investments to the extent of 99.99% shares of an Indian company. Now, during the year, the assessee, that is the Belgium resident, transferred its shareholding in Singapore company to another Indian company. Now, the question which arose that whether this particular transaction would be hit by the Explanation 5, and if so, would the treaty save the particular assessee from charge in India? The stand of the assessing officer was that when the Belgium assessee transferred the shares of the Singapore company, which in turn held shares in an Indian company, there was an indirect transfer by the Belgium company, that is the assessee, of Indian company shares, that is Achilles, and therefore Explanation 5 clearly applied to the facts of the case. Now, the assessing officer also further said that it is not only the Income Tax Act which applies, but even the provisions of the treaty that will catch hold of the assessee, and therefore the tax would be liable in India. Now, let us look at the provisions of the India-Belgium Treaty, which were before the ITAT, and whether the provisions give India the right to tax this particular transaction of sale of shares of Singapore company, which holds underlying Indian company shares. Now, the stand of the assessee before the tribunal was that if you look at Article 13.6 of the India-Belgium Treaty, it says that the gains from alienation of any property other than that mentioned in paragraphs 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 shall be taxable only in the contracting state of which the alienator is a resident. Now, in this particular case, as the alienator, that is the transferor, is a Belgium resident, and therefore, according to the assessee, the gains would be taxable as per Article 13(6) of the India-Belgium Treaty, and therefore only in Belgium. India does not have any right to tax. Now, the argument of the department here was that 13(5), which has to be looked at to decide the taxability of the transaction in India. Now, let us look at Article 13(5). It says gains from alienation of shares forming part of participation of at least 10% of the capital stock of a company, which is a resident of a contracting state, may be taxed in that state. Now, as we all know, the term contracting state is defined to mean Belgium or India when we look at India-Belgium Treaty. So to come within Article 13(5), the department made two arguments. The first argument is that the provisions of Explanation 5 to Section 911 are wide enough and they have to be incorporated inside the treaty. So to the effect that when the Belgium company transfers the shares of a Singapore company, which holds underlying Indian company shares, then it means that one will have to say that it is the shares of the Indian company which have been transferred, and therefore reading Article 13(5), if the shares of an Indian company are transferred, then India has the right to tax. Rejecting this argument of the department, the tribunal said that Article 13(5) cannot be read in line with Explanation 5 to Section 911. The provisions of the domestic law have no relevance whatsoever when interpreting the provisions of the treaty. Therefore, that point was specifically rejected. The second argument, which was considered by the tribunal, was does Article 13(5) to give India the right to tax, the shares which are transferred should be resident of a company in India. So if it is only if the Indian company shares are transferred, which is a resident of India, Article 13(5) gives India the right to tax. So the question was, can Explanation 5 to Section 911 be read in a manner that it is not only the provision which deems the shares to be situated in India, but it even makes the Singapore company a resident of India. So to rejecting that argument as well, the tribunal held that Explanation 5 is inserted only with a limited scope to hold that the shares of a foreign company will be deemed to be situated in India. But it does not mean that the foreign company, that is the Singapore company whose shares are being transferred, would become an Indian resident. And to conclude, the tribunal decided in assessee's favor and held that Article 13(6) would clearly govern the case and there can be no tax liability in India. The next decision which we will look at is the case of Volkswagen. Now, this is a case where the assessee was an Indian company. Now, the assessee, along with another group company, organized an event in Dubai for launching an Audi car. Now, this event was exclusively for Indian customers. The assessee sent invites to several Indian potential customers, dealers, Indian journalists to attend this event. The expenses of all these customers were borne by the Indian company. Now, to make this event more appealing, the assessee hired a celebrity who was a US resident for making an appearance at the launch event. Now, the question which arose that the payment which is made by the Volkswagen Finance, that is the assessee, to this foreign celebrity for making an appearance at the launch event, would that be subject to TDS or not? So the important point which was being considered by the tribunal is, does the income in the hands of this non-resident celebrity who makes an appearance in Dubai, can it be said to have accrued or deemed to have accrued in India? It is only if this condition is satisfied that one can say that if the non-resident was subjected to tax in India because of deemed accrual, then even the company, that is Volkswagen, who makes the payment was liable to deduct tax at source. Now, the tribunal came up with a unique concept saying that the term business connection has to be read in line with the technological developments. And therefore, the term business connection was wide enough to cover this particular transaction. Now, to come at this conclusion, the tribunal looked at several aspects. The first aspect which appealed to the tribunal was that, yes, the event had taken place in Dubai, but the entire focus of that event was India centric. Though the launch of the Audi car was in India or was in Dubai, but the benefits of that launch event would accrue to the assessee in India. The Indian customers had been flown to Dubai, the Indian journalists had been flown to Dubai, and therefore this benefit of the event would definitely accrue to the Indian business of the assessee. And it is solely on this reason that the celebrity was paid to come and appear at this launch event. And therefore, the tribunal took a view that the income which arose in the hands of the celebrity clearly accrued and arose on account of business connection in India. One more aspect which appealed to the tribunal was that the event-related expenses which were incurred by Volkswagen Finance were claimed as a deduction under 37. So the tribunal said that if the expense for the Dubai event are expenses which are wholly and exclusively incurred for the purpose of the assessee's business in India, then it's a natural corollary that the income from participation, even to the non-resident, has a business connection in India. The tribunal therefore coined a new phrase which said intangible business connection. The tribunal said that even though this business connection of the non-resident celebrity was intangible, it is only because the non-resident appeared in an event in Dubai, but ultimately the benefit of that event would accrue in India. Therefore, the tribunal held that the non-resident had an intangible business connection, and therefore any income which the non-resident celebrity earned from this particular business connection would be subject to tax in India. And therefore, the tribunal concluded that the assessee who made this payment to the non-resident was required to deduct tax at source before making this payment. Now we then come to the Supreme Court decision in the case of Ananda Social and Educational Trust. Now this decision revolved around the provision of section 12AA. Now the facts of this case were like this. The trust applied for registration under section 12AA within 2 months of its formation. So the question arose that does the commissioner have to look at the activities of the trust before it can grant registration? And therefore, if the trust is newly formed and has not commenced any activities, is the commissioner in a position to verify whether the activities or the objects of the trust are genuine? So the commissioner rejected the application under 12AA in this particular case and held that because the assessee is newly formed, there is no way in which the commissioner can decide whether the activities which are proposed would be genuine or not. Now let us look at section 12AA. It says that the commissioner on receipt of an application for registration shall, after satisfying himself about the objects of the trust and the genuineness of its activities, pass an order in writing registering the trust. So the commissioner rejected the application on the basis that because the trust is newly formed, I cannot verify its activities and therefore I am rejecting this application. The matter traveled all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court took a view that section 12AA is very wide enough to grant registration to an existing trust as well as to a newly registered trust. So therefore, even if a trust is newly formed, it can still apply for registration. There is no requirement in the statute which says that the trust should have been in existence and it should have undertaken activities before making the application. Reading section 12AA, Supreme Court interpreted the term activities in a very wide manner to include even proposed activities. So the Supreme Court said that the commissioner has to satisfy himself whether the objects which are proposed are genuine, and even the activities that the trust will thereafter carry on, would that be in furtherance of the trust's objects, and whether those proposed activities are genuine as well or not. So the Supreme Court took a view that it does not matter whether a new trust does not have any activities. It is still eligible to apply for registration under 12AA. However, in the judgment, the Supreme Court also cautioned that it is not as if in all instances the commissioner is bound to grant registration. In a case where a trust, before applying for registration, undertakes certain activities which are clearly contrary to the objects of the trust, then the ratio of this decision could have been different. Further, if the trust is formed, but for a long period of time it does not carry on activities, and then one fine day it makes an application for registration, that could also be looked at with some suspicion. But the ratio which was laid down was that as long as a new trust applies for registration, merely on that basis, it cannot be denied. One, the commissioner has to look at the proposed activities as well. Now, we then come to a recent decision of the Supreme Court in the case of Sri Chaudhary Transport Company. Now, this decision revolved around the provisions of 40A1. Now, this was a case where the assessee entered into a contract with a company for transporting the cement of that company to several locations. Now, as the assessee did not have any vehicles of its own, it in turn engaged the services of other truck owners or of truck operators for transporting the cement of Aditya Cement Limited. Now, the assessee, when it received money from Aditya Cement, tax was deducted by Aditya Cement. But in turn, when the assessee made payments to the individual truck owners, the assessee did not withhold any tax while making these payments. Several issues arose before the Supreme Court. Now, one of the issues was whether the tax is at all deductible under 194C. The argument of the assessee was that 194C, there is no contract or there is no privity of contract between the assessee and the truck owners. It is only because of the contract between the assessee and Aditya Cement that it has hired the services of these truck owners. The Supreme Court, rejecting that particular stand of the assessee, held that the contract between the company, that is Aditya Cement, and the assessee casted the responsibility to transport cement on the assessee. The company Aditya Cement had no connection or privity of contract between itself and the truck owners. The hiring the services of the truck owners was an independent decision of the assessee, and whether or not that particular thing was in writing, the assessee would still be subjected to withhold tax. And therefore, Supreme Court said that the assessee was in fact liable to deduct tax under 194C because the truck operators or the owners were subcontractors of the assessee. Now, holding that 194C applies, the next question which was taken up by the Supreme Court is that what happens, because here admittedly the assessee did not deduct tax at source under 194C. So the question which arose, second question which arose before the Supreme Court, is to whether disallowance under 40A1A would be confined only to the amount that remain payable and not to the amounts which are already paid by the assessee to the transport operators. Now, the argument of the assessee was that the Supreme Court in Palam Gas, though it has taken a view that 40A1A is wide enough to cover the term payable as well as the term paid, but this argument was made that the decision of the Supreme Court in Palam Gas required reconsideration. The Supreme Court, rejecting this particular argument of the assessee, held that Palam Gas, the Supreme Court took a very conscious view that the section 40A1A cannot be restricted only to events where the amount remains payable. It is also in a case where the amount is actually paid that the provisions of 40A1A would come into force. So therefore, rejecting this argument, Supreme Court said that the decision in Palam Gas covers the issue, and therefore the assessee would still be hit by the disallowance under 40A1A, even though the amount is already been paid and did not remain payable. Now, this next argument which was taken up by the assessee was the applicability of section 40A1A to the facts of this case. Now, this particular case pertained to financial year 4-5. The assessee argued that 40A1A was inserted by the Finance Number 2 Act 2004 with effect from 1st April 2005, and therefore it should apply only from financial year 5-6. And therefore the payments which were made by the assessee which pertain to financial year 4-5 cannot be subjected to disallowance under 40A1A. The second argument which was made was that even assuming Supreme Court rejected the first argument that the section applies from financial year 5-6, the second alternate argument was that 40A1A received was part of Finance Number 2 Act 2004, which received the presidential assent on 10th of September 2004. And therefore, in respect of payments which were made by the SSE before 10th of September 2004 should be out of disallowance of 40A1A, because the SSE could not have known that this particular provision would come into the statute. These were the two primary arguments in so far as this issue was concerned. The Supreme Court rejected both the arguments and held that the section 40A1A, which was inserted by the Finance Act 2004, clearly came into effect from 1st April 2005 and would therefore apply from assessment year 5-6. There is no basis to hold that the section would apply from assessment year 6-7. The second argument, which was taken by the SSE, that it should apply only to payments made after 10th of September, because that is the date on which presidential assent was received, was also rejected by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court took a view that the requirement to deduct tax was there in 194C, and the consequence of non-deduction was already specified in 201. That is, if the SSE did not withhold taxes, he would be treated as an SSE in default. So these requirements to withhold tax was already cast on the SSE, and therefore the provisions of 40A1A, it's not something new which would create prejudice or burden on the SSE, and therefore it cannot be said that 40A1A would apply only after 10th of September. Now the SSE, realizing that all its arguments were failing, took one more argument in respect to the amendment made by the Finance Number 2 Act 2014 in section 40A1A. Now this amendment, with effect from 1st April 2015, relaxes the provisions of 40A1A. Earlier, if any tax was not deducted, the entire amount was disallowed under 40A1A, which is now restricted to 30% of the sum payable on which the tax is deductible. So the SSE took the argument that this particular amendment by the Finance Number 2 Act 2014 should be treated as retrospective in nature, and therefore, even if the expenses incurred by the SSE are to be disallowed, they should be restricted to 30%. Now, before going to the Supreme Court's decision on this point, let us look at the CBDT Circular number 1 of 2015, which explained the provisions of the Finance Act 2014. The CBDT in the circular notes that the disallowance of the entire amount causes hardships to the SSE. CBDT further notes that the case of tax withholding is only a mode of collection of tax and it does not result into final discharge of tax liability. The CBDT also notes that it is to overcome this hardship which was being caused to the assessees by disallowing the entire amount that it is proposed to amend the provisions of 40A1A and to restrict the disallowance only to the extent of 30%. Now, this particular issue was decided by the Supreme Court against the SSE. Supreme Court took the view that the amendment by the Finance Number 2 Act 2014 cannot be held to be retrospective, and therefore, for years before the amendment, the entire expenses would be subjected to disallowance and not only 30% of the expenses. During the course of the argument, the SSE had relied on the decision of Calcutta Export, wherein it was held that the 2010 amendments were retrospective in nature because they were curative in nature and to avoid any hardships which were being caused to the SSE. Now, Supreme Court rejected this reliance on Calcutta Export's case and held that the provisions which were amended by the 2014 Act are on a different footing from the provision of the 2010 Finance Act. Supreme Court said that this provision or this amendment by the 2014 Act cannot be held to be curative in nature. It's a substantial provision and it is the will of the legislature and the decision of the legislature as to what percentage of the amount should be deducted, whether it should be 100% or 30% of the expenses. So the view taken by the Supreme Court would now become the law of the land, and therefore the Finance Number 2 Act 2014, the amendments would be treated as prospective in nature and will not apply to the past assessment years. Now we then come to the decision of the Bombay High Court in the case of Sesa Goa. Now the issue here was whether education cess would be allowable as a deduction in the year of payment. If we look at section 40, it provides a list of expenses which shall not be deducted in computing the income chargeable under the head profits and gains of business or profession. Now 40 clause 2, it says any sum paid on account of any rate or tax levied on the profits or gains of any business or profession, or assessed at a proportion of or otherwise on the basis of any profits or gains, shall not be allowed as a deduction while computing the business income. The issue here was whether this clause 2, when it talks about tax which shall not be deducted, would it even cover education cess which has been paid by the assessee? The High Court held in favor of the assessee, taking a view that the reference to cess cannot be read into 40A2. What is covered within the scope of clause 2 is only tax, and cess cannot be held to be in the nature of tax, which would fall within the scope of the disallowance. Though the department made an argument to the effect that it is in the nature of tax, but it was rejected by the Supreme Court. The Bombay High Court. So the Bombay High Court again looked at the legislative history of this particular section and made a reference to the section at the time of introduction. Now, when Income Tax Bill 1961 was introduced, it specifically referred to the term cess and said that even cess would not be deductible. But later on, it was omitted by the Select Committee of the Parliament, and thereafter the term which remained in the section was only tax, and therefore cess did not feature in the provisions of the Act. So the Bombay High Court took a view that as the deletion of the term cess was deliberate, one cannot say that it is hit by the provisions of 40A2 and therefore not deductible. Now it seems that one of the arguments that the department did not make was the fact that the Finance Act of each year, if one looks at it, in the chapter Rates of Taxes, the Finance Act says that the income tax shall be increased by the applicable surcharge and shall be further increased by an additional surcharge to be called education and health and education cess. Now, if one looks at the provisions of the Finance Act of each year, education cess is only a nomenclature which is given to an additional surcharge. And if that is so, the question arises is whether that is different from the tax which is not allowed as a deduction. But as things stand right now, the decision of the Bombay High Court will govern this particular issue, and education cess will be allowable as a deduction. We then look at the decision of SR Shipping. Now, this was a case where loan was payable by the assessee to the government of Karnataka. The government of Karnataka waived this particular loan, and the assessing officer took a stand that waiver of loan benefited the assessee in carrying on its business, and therefore such benefit would constitute income as per section 28.4. Now, section 28.4 reads that the value of any benefit or perquisite, whether convertible into money or not, arising from business or exercise of profession. The High Court, referring to the decision of the Supreme Court in Mahindra and Mahindra, took a view that benefit or perquisite to be taxable under 28.4 should be in a form other than money. So when a loan is waived, the effect of that waiver of loan is to be construed as if the assessee has received a cash in the hands, and therefore 28.4 would not apply to such an instance, and therefore 28.4 has no applicability to the facts of the case. Now, realizing that Mahindra's decision covers the issue, the revenue raised an argument that the waiver of loan is nothing but an operational subsidy which has been granted by the Karnataka government, and therefore the same would be taxable. Now, rejecting this argument, the court said that there is a fundamental difference between the term loan and subsidy, and the two cannot be equated. So therefore, even if a loan is written off or waived, it cannot take the character of subsidy. Now we then come to the decision of Nikon Systems by the Delhi Tribunal. Now, this was a case where fire broke out in the premises of the SSE and the SSE lost its entire stock. Though the SSE had insurance which covered this particular loss, but the insurance had not been settled till the time of assessment, and therefore the SSE took a stand that because it has suffered a loss due to fire, and therefore the loss has crystallized, and therefore should be allowed as a deduction during the year. Now, the assessing officer disallowed the loss and said that the stocks were insured against the damage by fire, and once the insurance company makes good this loss, it's the loss which is suffered by the SSE is merely contingent. There is no real loss which the SSE has suffered, which can be claimed as a deduction. Tribunal decided this issue in favor of the SSE and said that merely because an SSE has an insurance does not mean that the SSE has not incurred loss. The fact that the fire took place in the premises of the SSE, resulting in the stock being destroyed, that is the event of the current year. And once it is the event of the current year, the loss is also allowable in the current year as a deduction. As and when the insurance company repays the SSE, then at that point of time, the insurance claim which is received would be chargeable to tax under 41(1) at that particular point of time. We now look at the decision of Seshasai Steels, the decision of the Supreme Court. Now, in this particular decision, the sequence of events have a particular relevance. 15th of May 1998, the SSE entered into an agreement to sell land with Vijay Shanti Builders. Under the agreement, the SSE granted permission to the builder to construct on the land. On 27th of November 98, power of attorney was also executed, whereby the builder was empowered to execute the necessary sale agreements and to present before the competent authorities all documents as were necessary to enable development of the property. Now, this was the events which took place in financial year 98-99. We then look at financial year 2003-4. Now in 2003, the assessing officer detected that a memo of compromise was entered into by the SSE with the builder. And pursuant to this memo of compromise, the SSE received the consideration which was remaining for that particular transaction. Now, in this particular assessment year 4-5, when this memo of compromise was entered into, no return was filed. Now, according to the assessing officer, this was clearly a case where income had escaped assessment and a notice was issued under 148 for assessment year 4-5 on the basis that the SSE did not furnish complete details and did not offer capital gains on the sale of land. Now, the issue before the Supreme Court was determining which was the year when this transfer had taken place. Whether the transfer took place in assessment year 99-2000 or did it take place in assessment year 4-5. Now here the SSE wanted to argue that the transfer had already been completed in assessment year 99-2000 because that was the year in which agreement to sell was entered into. That was the year when license was given to the builder to enter upon the premises. And that was the year when a power of attorney was also executed. According to the SSE, assessment year 2004-5 had no relevance whatsoever to the facts of the case. Now, Supreme Court, taking into account all the agreements, took a view that it is assessment year 4-5 when it can be said that the transfer took place. Supreme Court rejected the argument of the SSE that the transfer had already taken place in assessment year 99-2000. Supreme Court said that to attract 53A of the Transfer of Property Act in assessment year 99-2000, one of the prerequisite conditions is that the transferee, that is the SSE, the builder must have taken possession of the property. Now, Supreme Court said that as per the agreement to sell, which was entered into in assessment year 99-2000, license was given to the builder to enter the land and construct. According to the Supreme Court, license cannot be equated to possession. License is merely a legal concept which denotes control over the land. Whether physically possession has been given or not has to be verified. So according to the Supreme Court, 53A of the Transfer of Property Act did not apply in assessment year 99-2000. The next argument of the assessee was that in 99-2000, there was an agreement to sell which enabled the builder to enjoy the property, and therefore the provisions of 247(6) were attracted in assessment year 99-2000. Now, Supreme Court, rejecting this particular argument, said that even 247(6) had no applicability to the facts of the case. Supreme Court said that on the date of agreement to sell, the rights of the assessee were intact, both as to ownership as well as to possession, and therefore it could not be said that there was a transfer in assessment year 99-2000. The next point which was considered by the Supreme Court, that assuming there is no transfer in 99-2000, but to bring the assessee to tax in assessment year 4-5, there should be a transfer which has taken place in assessment year 2004-5. The Supreme Court noted that in assessment year 2004-5, when the compromise deed was entered into, all the checks mentioned in the compromise deed were encashed by the assessee. So Supreme Court took a view that the rights which the assessee had in the property were extinguished on the receipt of the last check, and therefore 247(2) clearly applied because the assessee's rights in the property had got extinguished in 2004-5, and also in 2004-5 one could apply 247(6) to say that because of this compromise deed, it resulted in a transaction which had the effect of transferring the immovable property. Now, coming to the next decision, we look at the Karnataka High Court's decision in the case of Ramaiah Reddy. So this was a case where the assessee was a member of an HUF. This HUF was engaged in real estate business. The HUF got partitioned, and the part of the stock in trade of the HUF was received by the assessee, and the assessee thereafter continued the real estate business using the stock in trade which it had received from the HUF on partition. Now the question which arose that in the current year, the assessee transferred or sold certain land which it had received on partition of the HUF and earned income. The question which arose before the Karnataka High Court was whether this gain which was made by the assessee on transfer of land could it be treated as a business income, or was it in the nature of capital gains. Now the assessing officer in the assessment held that the assessee had received capital asset on partition of the HUF and thereafter converted the capital asset into stock in trade, and therefore in the year in which the land is transferred, that is the present year, the same would attract tax as per section 45(2). Now, rejecting this particular stand of the assessing officer, the High Court held that the asset which was received by the assessee was a part of stock in trade of the HUF, and that was a part of the real estate business which was carried on by the HUF, and on receipt of this particular stock in trade, the assessee continued to carry on that real estate business by using that stock in trade. So therefore, the land which was received being in the nature of stock in trade, and thereafter it was continued to be used by the assessee as stock in trade, there was no material whatsoever to show that the asset which was received was in the nature of capital asset. The High Court also said that the character of the asset which is received on partition did not change, and therefore there was no material or even any provision in the Act which said that any asset received on partition has to be treated as capital asset. Further, the High Court noted that there was nothing on record to indicate that the capital asset had been converted to stock in trade, and therefore the provisions of 45(2) have no relevance whatsoever, and the gains which were made by the assessee on transfer of land during the year has to be assessed as business income. Now we look at another decision of the Karnataka High Court in the case of Kempfin Services. Now here the assessee was an NBFC. It was engaged in the activity of investment in shares. It passed a resolution during the year to discontinue its trading activity, and therefore the stock in trade which was held by the assessee was converted into capital asset. Now the assessing officer held that this conversion of stock in trade into investment in the books of account has no relevance whatsoever to decide the nature of the gain when this particular asset is transferred. And therefore, according to the officer, the profit which is made on sale of these converted shares would be taxed as business income because they were in the nature of stock in trade earlier, and this conversion into capital asset has no meaning. Now, Karnataka High Court referred to the explanatory memorandum in the Finance Bill 2008, wherein it was specifically noted that the provisions of Section 45 did not envisage a situation or did not provide for a situation where a stock in trade is converted into or treated as a capital asset. And therefore, there was no provision till this amendment by the 2018 Act to cover such an instance. So therefore, the High Court noted that a specific provision was inserted by the 2018 Act to cover even a case of conversion of stock in trade into capital asset. And therefore, the assessing officer's view that this particular instance of conversion has to be taxed in accordance with 45(2) had no relevance whatsoever. The Karnataka High Court upheld the stand taken by the assessee, which was that the income which arose on conversion on transfer of these shares had to be taxed under the head capital gains and not under the head business income. The High Court also upheld that there were genuine reasons for conversion of stock in trade into a capital asset, and that could not be a matter that had to be gone into. So we then come to the decision of the Delhi Tribunal in the case of Futures Next Services Private Limited. Now, this was a case where the assessee sold a property during the year and received a sum of rupees 2 crores as per the sale deed. Now, the value of this property, as per the records of the stamp valuation authorities, was around 2 crore 87 lakhs. Now, the issue which arose before the Delhi Tribunal was whether the opening written down value of these block of assets had to be reduced by the actual sale consideration which was received, that is rupees 2 crores, or whether the written down value had to be reduced by the stamp duty valuation, which was around 2.87 crores. The Delhi Tribunal noted the provisions of 43(6), which said that the written down value of a block of assets has to be reduced by the monies which are payable in respect of any asset falling within that block which is sold. So the ITAT rejected the stand of the assessing officer and said that the provisions of 50C cannot be incorporated for computing the value of the block of assets. And therefore, once the asset has been transferred, the block would go down by the amount that has been received by the assessee and not by an artificial stamp duty value. The tribunal noted that the provisions of 50C substitute the full value of consideration only insofar as the provisions of 48 are concerned. So if a capital asset is transferred, which is land or building, then the provisions of 50C would apply. But the same has no relevance in deciding the written down value under 43. And therefore, the tribunal, deciding in favor of the assessee, held that the written down value of the block has to be reduced by a sum of rupees 2 crores, which was the actual sale consideration, which was received by the assessee. We then come to a decision of the Karnataka High Court in the case of Naveen Jolly. Now, this was a case where the assessee transferred certain shares which it held in a company and earned long-term capital gains. Now, the assessee during the year constructed a residential property and claimed exemption as per the provisions of 54F. Now the officer denied this exemption which was claimed by the assessee and took a view that the assessee owned 9 residential flats and therefore this claim under 54F did not stand. So the High Court ultimately decided in favor of the assessee and granted the benefits under 54F. Now the rationale for taking this view was twofold. One was that out of 9 flats which were held by the assessee, 7 were sanctioned for commercial use and therefore those 7 flats had no relevance whatsoever in deciding the issue at hand. Therefore, the decision or the dispute really before the Karnataka High Court was restricted to 2 flats. Now, these 2 flats were sanctioned for residential use, but it was pointed out by the assessee that they were in fact being used for commercial purposes and therefore even these particular flats should not be considered while determining the eligibility to claim exemption under 54F. The Karnataka High Court accepted this particular argument of the assessee and held that the usage of the property has to be considered. The fact whether the properties were sanctioned for residential use or not have no relevance. If those 2 flats were actually being used for commercial purposes, then they would not be counted in deciding whether the assessee is eligible under 54F or not. We then come to the decision of the Chennai Tribunal in the case of Bhumidhi Amarendrani. Now, this was a case where the tribunal decided the issue as to whether the first proviso to 50C, which was inserted by the Finance Act 2016 with effect from 1st April 2017, had a retrospective effect or not. Now, let us look at the facts of this case. So, on 4th of August 2012, the assessee entered into an agreement for sale to transfer his property for a consideration of 19 crores. Assessee received 6 crores on the date of agreement. On 2nd of May 2013, sale deed was entered into and it was registered. Now, according to the assessee, this amendment by the 2016 Act with effect from 1st April 2017 had a retrospective effect. And therefore, what has to be looked at is the stamp duty value as on the date on which this agreement for sale had been entered into, that is 4th of August 2012. And as on that date, that is 4th of August 12, the value of the property, that is the stamp duty value of the property, was less than 19 crores and therefore there could be no applicability of 50C. Now, the department's argument was that because this amendment was inserted specifically from 1st April 2017, it had a prospective effect and therefore in the particular facts of this case, the stamp duty value would have to be looked at as on 2nd of May 2013 when the sale deed was registered. So the tribunal, holding in favor of the assessee, took the view that the proviso to 50C applies retrospectively. And therefore, once the assessee has entered into an agreement for sale, even prior to this insertion of first proviso, the stamp duty value has to be taken as on the date on which the agreement for sale has been entered into. The reason for taking this view was that the reason for bringing about this amendment was that once the agreement for sale has been entered into, the purchaser has the right to enforce the agreement specifically through a civil court. And therefore, once an agreement for sale is entered into, the vendor cannot claim a higher amount than what has been agreed. And therefore, this provision was inserted in 50C, which allowed the assessee to take the stamp duty value as on the date of agreement. And therefore, the proviso, according to the tribunal, merely clarifies the existing position of law and is therefore to be treated as retrospective in nature. Now, we are then look at the Chennai Tribunal's decision in the case of Palaniappan Chettiar. Now, this case pertained to assessment year 16-17. This was a case where the assessee purchased vacant land for a consideration of 3 crore 51 lakhs. And the stamp duty value here was 3 crore 64 lakhs. Now, according to the assessing officer, this differential between the purchase price and the stamp duty value had to be taxed under 56(2)(7) in the hands of the assessee. Now, here the question arose before the Chennai tribunal was whether the amendment by the Finance Act 2018, which says that if the differential between the stamp duty value and the actual sale consideration is to the extent of 5%, then there can be no applicability of the deeming provision of 56. The argument of the assessee was that this provision was really inserted with a view to minimize the hardship of assessees who are entering into real estate transactions, and therefore taking note of this hardship which arose, that the legislature has brought this amendment whereby a leeway was granted to the extent of 5%. Now the tribunal took a view in favor of the assessee and held that the differential in the stamp duty value in the facts of this particular case was only to the extent of 3.711%, and therefore looking at the amendment or the clarification which has been brought about by the 2018 Act, one can apply that even retrospectively to this particular assessment year. Now we then come to the decision in Sharan Hospitality. Now this was a case where the assessee purchased a commercial property on 18th of December 2008. The intention behind purchasing this property was to earn rental income by letting out this particular property. Now, though the purchase had taken place on 18th of December 2008, the occupancy certificate was issued by the local authority only in May 2009. Now, the assessee leased out this property by entering into a lease agreement in August 2009. Though the lease agreement was dated August 2009, it specifically granted possession of the property to the lessee from 1st of April 2009. That is the date even before the occupancy certificate was received in respect of this property. Now, during the assessment, the assessing officer took a view that because the assessee had purchased this property in December 2008, therefore, he should be subjected to notional rental taxation between the period 1st January 2009 up to 31st of March 2009. Now, High Court deleted this addition of notional rent and held that even though the property was purchased in December 2018, the occupational certificate was received only in May 2009, and therefore, before the occupation certificate is received, by operation of law, the property could not have been legally occupied by the assessee, nor could he have given a license to another person to enter upon the property. And if that is the provision of the law, then there is no question of charging tax on a notional basis for the period 1st January to 31st March 2009. We then come to an interesting decision of the Bangalore Tribunal in the case of Goldman Sachs. Now, this was a case where the tribunal was concerned with an issue as to whether if an assessee incurs expenditure to meet the corporate social responsibility prescribed under the Companies Act, whether that same expenditure can also be claimed as an eligible deduction under ATG, provided the assessee satisfies the other conditions of ATG. Now, in this case, the assessee incurred an expenditure of around 4 crore 72 lakhs to meet the requirements of the Companies Act under 135. Now, out of this entire sum incurred for CSR activities, a sum of around 2.25 crore was also eligible for deduction under ATG because it satisfied the requirements of ATG, and therefore the assessee claimed 50% of that amount as a deduction under ATG. Now, the officer disallowed the claim of the assessee under ATG and took a view that this amount which has been incurred by the assessee is not voluntary. The amount has been expended because of a special requirement in the Companies Act, whereby the assessee company has to incur some expenditure for CSR activities. And once that is so, it cannot be said that this amount is in the nature of a voluntary donation eligible for deduction under ATG. Now, the tribunal observed that Section 80G has several clauses wherein several contributions are eligible for deduction. Now, out of the list of several items, specifically there are two items, that is the Swachh Bharat Kosh and the Clean Ganga Fund, which specifically provide that deduction under 80G will be granted only in respect of sums that are paid other than the sums paid pursuant to the CSR responsibility. So therefore, looking at these two particular clauses, the tribunal took a view that whether legislature intended to grant deduction under 80G only in respect of sums over and above the CSR spending that has been taken care of and specifically provided in 80G. And once that is not the case in respect of other clauses, there is no bar in the statute which debars the assessee from making a claim under 80G in respect of the very same item which is covered under CSR activities. Now we then come to the decision of the Supreme Court in the case of Dalmia Power. Now this was a case where two assessees, Dalmia Power Limited and Dalmia Cement Bharat Limited, entered into a scheme of arrangement whereby 9 companies were amalgamated into the assessee companies. Now the appointed date of the scheme was 1st of January 2015 and the effective date was 30th October 2018. Now as we are all aware, as per the decision of the Supreme Court in the case of Marshall Sons, a scheme of amalgamation takes effect from the appointed date, that is 1st of January 2015. Now, the scheme was sanctioned by the respective high courts, and on sanction of the scheme, the return which was filed by the assessee for assessment year 16-17 was revised. This was required because from appointed date, that is 1st January 2015, the amalgamated companies had to incorporate the profits and losses of the amalgamating companies, and therefore the return which was originally filed had to be revised. Now, because the orders of the High Court sanctioning the scheme of amalgamation were received beyond the time limit by which the assessee companies could revise their returns, the assessees filed manual income tax returns with the assessing officer. Now, the assessing officer had issued a notice under 143(2), but later on withdrew the same and did not carry out any assessment in respect of these two assessee companies. Now, because these assessee companies had losses, it was in the interest of the assessee that assessments are conducted and the quantum of loss is crystallized. So therefore, the assessee filed a writ petition before the Madras High Court requesting the Madras High Court to direct the officer to complete the assessment for AY 16-17 after taking into account the revised return which were filed by the amalgamated companies manually and also the scheme which was approved by the NCLT. Now, the single judge of the High Court allowed the petitions, but the division bench later on reversed the decision of the single judge bench and held that the assessee has to comply with the procedure for filing belated revised returns. The assessee cannot rely on the amalgamation scheme to say that once the scheme has been sanctioned, the returns have to be accepted even though they are filed manually. Now this matter traveled to the Supreme Court and the argument of the department was on similar lines as the division bench of the Karnataka High Court's decision, that the assessee had filed the revised returns belatedly and therefore the assessing officer had no obligation to consider those returns. And secondly, even though the time limit for filing the revised return had expired, the assessee could have very well approached the CBDT praying for relaxation because of this particular case of amalgamation. Now, Supreme Court took into account these arguments of the department but was not convinced. Supreme Court held that the amalgamation scheme as approved by the NCLT entitled the assessee companies to file revised returns even after the time limit specified in 139 had expired, So once the amalgamation scheme as approved by the NCLT comes into force, there is no requirement whatsoever. And in fact, it is binding on the assessing officer to accept the revised returns filed manually. The Supreme Court also noted that as per the Companies Act 2013, when an amalgamation scheme is filed with the High Court, notices are issued to the tax authorities. Now, the tax authorities, on receipt of these notices, can file objections to the scheme. But in this particular case, no objection was raised by the department within the period of 30 days given to them for making these objections. And therefore, the Supreme Court said that the department could have raised this objection at that particular stage and could have contested that revised returns or for any particular procedural requirements would have to be undertaken in a particular manner. Now, Supreme Court then looked at 139(5), which permits an assessee to revise its return if he discovers any omission or wrong statement in the original return. Supreme Court noted that the provisions of 139(5) apply only when there is an omission or a wrong statement in the return. And in this particular case of amalgamation, that is not so. The revised returns are required to be filed because the amalgamated company has to incorporate the decisions or has to incorporate the accounts of the amalgamating companies. It is not because of the reason that the amalgamated company has noticed any omission or wrong statement that it has filed a revised return. Supreme Court also said that it was impossible to comply with the time limits under 139(5) because the NCLT orders were passed beyond the prescribed time limit under 139(5). And therefore, the assessee could not be put on a worse footing to say that because the time limit has expired, your revised returns have no value. We then look at an interesting decision of the Supreme Court in the case of NDTV. Now, this decision pertains to reopening and lays down several important principles insofar as reopening of an assessment is concerned. The assessee, an Indian company, had a subsidiary in United Kingdom, NDTV Network PLC. Now, this UK subsidiary issued bonds of 100 million to several entities who subscribed to these bonds, and these bonds were subsequently redeemed at a premium. Now, assessee had furnished a guarantee for this transaction. Now, in the original assessment for assessment year 8-9, the assessing officer specifically looked at this transaction of issuance of bonds by the UK subsidiary and furnishing guarantee by the assessee. During the original assessment proceedings, the assessing officer did not doubt the validity of the transactions, but it only made certain additions in respect of guarantee fees that accrued in the hands of the assessee on account of the guarantee which was given. Now, subsequently, a notice was issued by the assessing officer under 148 on 31st of March 2015, stating that certain income had escaped assessment, and therefore the assessment for assessment year 8-9 had to be reopened. Now, the reasons which were stated by the assessing officer for reopening the case were several. The first reason was that an addition was made in the subsequent assessment year 9-10, where the DRP took a view that this transaction of raising the money by the assessee from its subsidiary was bogus, and it was in fact the undisclosed income of the assessee. In the reasons, the officer also referred to complaints which were received from minority shareholders, where they had alleged that the money which was introduced in the UK subsidiary was in a circuitous manner and was really the assessee's money, which again came back in a circuitous manner to the assessee. So this was the reasons on which the assessment was reopened by the assessing officer. Now, the Supreme Court was concerned with whether the reopening was valid and would it be justified looking at the legal provisions. Now, several important principles are laid down by the Supreme Court in this particular case. One of the arguments made by the assessee was that the assessing officer cannot reopen the assessment for 8-9 because in the original assessment, detailed questions were asked relating to the transaction and detailed inquiries were made. Now, rejecting this argument, the Supreme Court said that merely because the original assessment order is a detailed one does not mean that the assessing officer does not have the power to reopen at a subsequent stage. But the Supreme Court did accept that it is a very settled position that the reopening can only be if there is a reason to believe. So the officer has to have a reason to believe, and only if he has the reason, he can reopen the assessment. The reassessment cannot take place on a change of opinion. Next principle which is laid down by the Supreme Court is as to whether the reliance by the assessing officer on the proceedings of the DRP for the subsequent year, would that constitute a sufficient reason for reopening the assessment? Supreme Court said that yes, any information which comes to the notice of the assessing officer, even if that information pertains to the proceedings for the subsequent assessment years, they can definitely form a tangible material on which the assessing officer can reopen an assessment for an earlier year. At the stage of issuance of this 148 notice, all that is required is that the assessing officer should have a prima facie view which he should have formed on some tangible information which has come to his notice. Now, the Supreme Court then dealt with the first proviso to section 147. Now, the first proviso states that no action shall be taken by an assessing officer under 147 after the expiry of 4 years from the end of the relevant assessment year, unless any income chargeable to tax has escaped assessment by reason of the failure on the part of the assessee to disclose fully and truly all the material facts. So the question which arose before the Supreme Court was that the reopening, would it be justified after 4 years, and what is the duty of the assessee to disclose that information? Now, Supreme Court said that the assessee's duty is to disclose only the primary facts. So in this particular fact situation, the assessee, once he has disclosed that the transaction of issuance of bonds by its subsidiary had taken place during the original assessment, that is good enough. The assessee is not mandated to disclose secondary facts. Supreme Court said that once the primary transaction or the primary facts are before the officer, it is for the officer to draw inferences from those facts. It is not the assessee's duty to provide all the information or draw inferences from the primary facts. Once the primary facts are disclosed by the assessee, the extended period of 6 years, as per the first proviso, will not be available to the assessing officer to issue the notice. Now, the Supreme Court then considered the effect of the second proviso to section 147. Now, the second proviso states that the time limit in the first proviso, that is 6 years, shall not apply in relation to any income which arises from any asset located outside India, which is chargeable to tax and escapes assessment. As per section 149(1)(c), a notice for reopening under 148 can be issued up to 16 years, provided the income which has escaped assessment is in relation to an asset located outside India. So the argument here made by the revenue was that because this transaction of issuance of bonds by the subsidiary had taken place outside India, and therefore the second proviso was attracted, and therefore the department had an extended period of 16 years to complete or to issue a notice of reassessment. Now, Supreme Court laid down certain principles as to when would this time limit of 16 years come into force and whether the same applied in the facts of the particular case. The Supreme Court noted that the notice for reopening in this case, as well as the reasons for reopening, did not mention that the officer intended to invoke the second proviso to section 148. It was nowhere indicated by the revenue that the notice or the assessment or this extended period of 16 years applied to the facts of the case. This reference to the second proviso was made only when the assessing officer was disposing the objections raised by the assessee. The Supreme Court held against the department and said that if the department wants to rely on the second proviso and wants to take into account this extended period of 16 years, the department has a duty to inform the assessee that it is doing so. And such fact should be referred to either in the notice for reopening or at least in the reasons for reopening. The Supreme Court said that the assessee cannot be taken by surprise and he cannot be subjected to this extended period of 16 years merely at a subsequent stage. So the Supreme Court decided in favor of the assessee and said that this extended period of 16 years would not apply to the facts of the case because there was nothing in the notice and or in the reasons for reopening that the department wanted to invoke this particular proviso. Now we then look at a decision of the Bombay High Court in the case of Anand Developers. Now this was a case where assessment was reopened after a period of 4 years. The assessee challenged the notice for reopening by filing a writ petition in the High Court. The assessee's arguments before the High Court was that the assessment order was passed under 143(3) originally, and at that point of time the assessing officer had taken into account all the details which were furnished by the assessee, and because there was no failure on the part of the assessee to disclose the true and complete disclosures, the reopening after a period of 4 years did not stand. High Court agreed with the assessee and paused the reassessment proceedings. The principle laid down by the High Court was that the proviso to section 147 is very clear that if the assessing officer proposes to reopen an assessment after the period of 4 years from the end of the assessment year, he can do so only if there is a failure on the part of the assessee to disclose fully and truly all the material facts which were necessary. Now, the assessing officer is also required to specifically state in the notice for reopening as to what was the material which was not disclosed by the assessee. So, in a case where a reopening takes place after 4 years, the officer cannot merely make a statement that yes, there was some material which was not disclosed. The High Court said that the assessee has to give complete details as to which facts or what material was not disclosed by the assessee which led to the income having escaped assessment. Because that was not so in the facts of this case, the High Court quashed the reassessment proceedings. We then look at a decision of the Amritsar Tribunal in the case of Karamjit Rai. Now this was again a case of reopening where information was received by the officer that the assessee had purchased a land for a consideration of some 68.50 lakhs and also incurred certain registration charges. Now the assessing officer issued a notice for reopening by holding that this investment which was made by the assessee was not explained and therefore income had escaped assessment. Now the tribunal held in favor of the assessee and quashed the reassessment proceedings and said that the reasons for reopening should clearly show that the assessee has relied on the information received. The assessing officer, apart from the information which he receives, has to apply his mind to the facts or to the information which he receives and thereafter take a form of belief that the income has escaped assessment. The tribunal recorded that nowhere was it shown as to what information and corroborative materials or records had been independently examined and verified by the assessing officer. The tribunal said that there was nothing on record to show that the assessee had applied his mind and independently arrived at a belief that income had escaped assessment. And the officer had also failed to establish the nexus between the investment made by the assessee and as to whether that investment was really in the nature of income which had escaped assessment. We then come to a decision of the Delhi High Court in the case of Savita Kapila, which I suppose will have a very wide implication to decide the position or the duties of the legal heirs of the assessee. Now, Savita Kapila was a daughter of Mr. Mohinder Paul Kapila. Now, the assessing officer received certain information that Mr. Mohinder Paul Kapila had certain deposits, the source of which were not explained, and therefore the income had escaped assessment. Now, looking at the dates, 21st of December 2018 was the day on which Mr. Kapila expired. Now, notice was issued under 148 by the assessing officer on 31st of March 2019, that is after the date of death of Mr. Mohinder Paul Kapila. Now, the assessing officer was not aware about the death of Mr. Kapila, and therefore the notice was issued in the name of Mr. Kapila and was sent at his last known address. Now, these notices and summons issued by the assessing officer remained unanswered. Thereafter, notices were also issued to the banks under 133(6), and thereby the assessing officer traced the number of Savita Kapila, and thereafter the officer came to know that Mr. Mohinder Kapila had expired. Now, thereafter, on 15th of October 2019, Ms. Savita Kapila filed a death certificate of Mr. Kapila on the e-portal of the tax department. Now, because Mr. Kapila had expired, the reassessment proceedings were transferred by the assessing officer to the PAN of Savita Kapila, and the reassessment order was passed on 27th of December 2019 in the name of Savita Kapila. Now, one thing to be noted here that the notice was issued in the name of Mohinder Kapila and the reassessment order was passed in the name of the legal heir. This reassessment order was challenged by the assessee before the Delhi High Court by way of a writ petition. Now, one of the arguments for the department was that this petition should be dismissed at the outset because the assessee has an alternate remedy. The assessee could very well file an appeal to the Commissioner of Income Tax Appeals against the reassessment order and contest all the issues, take up all the arguments before the Commissioner Appeals. The Delhi High Court rejected this contention of the department and said that an alternative statutory remedy does not operate as a bar when a writ petition is filed in three events. One, where the writ petition is filed to enforce any of the fundamental rights. Two, where there is a violation of principles of natural justice. And three, where the order or the notice or the proceedings are wholly without jurisdiction. So therefore, the Delhi High Court did not accept the department's contention that this petition should be thrown out at the outset because of alternate remedy. The second issue which was before the Delhi High Court as to what happens to a notice which is issued under 148 in the name of an incorrect person. Now here what has happened was that notice was issued in the name of Mr. Kapila, and therefore the notice was issued after the death of Mr. Kapila, and therefore it was issued in the name of a non-existing person. So the Delhi High Court said that issuance of a notice under 148 is the foundation for reopening an assessment. It is of utmost importance that the officer for acquiring jurisdiction to reopen an assessment should issue notice in the name of the correct person. The Delhi High Court further said that the requirement to issue notice in the name of a correct person is not a procedural requirement, but it is a primary condition which decides whether a notice is valid or not. The Delhi High Court therefore said that a notice which is issued in the name of a dead person would be treated as null and void. Now, a similar view as that taken by the Delhi High Court has also been taken by the Bombay High Court in the case of Rupa Dhumatkar versus ACIT. The next issue which was decided by the Delhi High Court was whether the provisions of section 159 of the Act apply. The Delhi High Court said that 159 have no applicability on the facts of the case. Those provisions would apply only in a situation where the assessing officer initiates certain proceedings against the assessee when he is alive, and thereafter, because of the death of the assessee, those legal representatives step into the shoes of the deceased assessee. Here in this case, where the assessee had already died before the notice was issued under 148, the provisions of 159 have no applicability whatsoever. The next issue which was decided by the Delhi High Court was as to what is the obligation on the legal heirs. Now here, the officer, when he issued the notice under 148, had no knowledge whatsoever that Mr. Kapila had died. So does it mean that it is the responsibility of the legal heirs to intimate the assessing officer about the death? And if that is not done, then the provisions or the proceedings which were taken by the officer for reopening stand. The Delhi High Court said that there is no provision in the Act which burdens a legal representative to inform the factum of death of an assessee to the tax department. Delhi High Court further said that the fact whether the PAN record is updated or not, or whether the department was made aware by the legal representatives or not, is irrelevant. There is no duty whatsoever on the legal heirs to inform the assessing officer about the death of the assessee. The next point which arose was because the notice was issued in the name of a non-existing entity or non-existing person, would the provisions of section 292B at all save the notice? Now, section 292B states that no return of income assessment notice which has been furnished or made or issued shall be invalid merely by reason of any mistake, defect or omission in such return of income assessment or notice if the return or the notice in substance conforms with the intent and purpose of the Act. The Delhi High Court said that the provisions of 292B would not apply to the facts of the case because issuance of notice upon a dead person would not come within the ambit of mistake, defect or omission. Issuance of notice in the name of a correct person goes to the root of the matter and cannot be saved by the provisions of 292B. So then the argument of the department was whether 292BB applies in this case. So 292BB says that where an assessee has appeared in any proceedings or cooperated in any inquiry, it shall be deemed that any notice which was required to be served upon him has been duly served in time, and the assessee cannot thereafter take any objection at a later stage that the notice was not validly issued. Looking at the provisions of 292BB, the Delhi High Court took a view that the same would not apply to a legal representative of the assessee, and therefore there is no bar on the assessee to take this point that the notice was issued without any jurisdiction. The Delhi High Court also stated that even otherwise, it cannot be said that Savita Kapila had cooperated in the assessment proceedings. All that she had done was that she had merely uploaded the death certificate of the deceased assessee, and therefore that cannot be considered as a compliance or a cooperation in the reassessment proceedings. So looking at all the issues involved in the writ petition, the High Court quashed the reassessment notice as well as the reassessment order. We then look at a decision of the Delhi Tribunal in the case of Dev Mill. Now, this was a case where the assessment of this particular assessee was selected for limited scrutiny with respect to verifying certain long-term capital gains which were offered by the assessee. Now, during the assessment, the officer noticed that the assessee had claimed deduction in respect of certain short-term capital loss which was set off against the long-term capital gains. Now, according to the assessing officer, the short-term loss which was claimed by the assessee was suspicious and therefore had to be verified. Now, to verify this particular aspect, the officer obtained approval from the principal CIT to convert the case from limited scrutiny to complete scrutiny. Thereafter, the officer passed the order wherein he treated this transaction of purchase of shares as a sham and as a device to avoid payment of tax. Now, the issue before the Delhi tribunal here was the validity of the assessment which was initially picked up for limited scrutiny and thereafter converted into a complete scrutiny assessment. Now let us look at CBDT instruction number 5 of 2016, which says that the officer, when he proposes to take up complete scrutiny in a case where originally it was earmarked for limited scrutiny, the officer has to form a reasonable view that there is a possibility of under-assessment of income if the case is not examined under complete scrutiny. The instruction further states that while forming this view, the officer should ensure that there is a credible material or information which is available on record for forming such a view. This view of the officer should not be based on mere suspicion, conjecture, or an unreliable source. And furthermore, there has to be a direct nexus between the available material and formation of such view. The tribunal then looked at the proposal which was drafted by the officer for conversion of this limited scrutiny into complete scrutiny. This was essential to decide whether the scrutiny which is converted would stand or not. So the proposal stated that the assessee has shown a short-term capital loss, and this transaction appears to be suspicious in nature, and probably this loss has been created to reduce the incidence of tax, and that this issue needs to be thoroughly examined to ascertain the genuineness of this loss. The Delhi tribunal struck down the assessment order and stated that the instructions behind conversion of a limited scrutiny into a complete scrutiny are that the assessing officer should not carry out a fishing and roving inquiry. There should be maximum objectivity and there should be checks and balances on the powers of the assessing officer. The tribunal, looking at the proposal based on which the assessment was converted into a complete scrutiny, noted that there was no cogent material whatsoever which was mentioned by the officer which enabled the officer to reach the conclusion that the case was fit for conversion. Secondly, no reasonable view was formed by the assessing officer as per the CBDT instructions in an objective manner. The tribunal also said that the assessing officer's view for conversion of the assessment is merely based on suspicion and inference. And therefore, when the conversion is merely with a view to make fishing or roving inquiries, the same is not valid. The tribunal also noted that the approval of the principal CIT was equally in a mechanical manner without looking into the material or without forming a particular balanced view. And therefore, the tribunal struck down the assessment on this particular aspect. Now we then come to a decision of the Supreme Court in the case of super malls. So in this case, some search was carried out at the residence of the director of the assessee company. Now during the search, certain documents which pertain to the assessee were seized. Consequently, notice was issued to the assessee under 153C. Now the assessing officer of the director of the assessee company as well as the assessee company was the same person. Now the issue which arose before the Supreme Court was whether the provisions of 153C which require the assessing officer of the searched person to be satisfied and to record a satisfaction note was that complied or not. The argument of the assessee was that the satisfaction note which was recorded by the officer of the search party, that is the director's officer, there was no such note. The note which was recorded was only by the officer in relation to the assessee company. Now the revenue took the argument that if the assessing officer is the same, there is no requirement to have two separate satisfaction notes. And if the assessing officers are same, if the officer records one note, that is a good compliance of the provisions of 153C. So the Supreme Court noted that what are the requirements of 153C? Supreme Court said that before issuing a notice under 153C, the officer of the searched person must be satisfied that any document which is seized during the search pertains to a person other than the searched person. After recording such satisfaction, the AO of the searched person may transmit the records to the officer who has jurisdiction over the other person. And thereafter, the officer of that other person, on receiving this particular document or information, may proceed to issue a notice with respect to the other person. So the Supreme Court was then concerned with this peculiar fact where the officer of the searched person, that is the director of the assessee company, and the other person, that is the assessee itself, were the same. And therefore the Supreme Court said that one satisfaction note which is issued by the assessing officer in this case is sufficient because the officers are common and therefore there is no requirement to maintain two separate satisfaction notes on the file of the director of the assessee company as well as on the file of the assessee company itself. But the Supreme Court did say that the officer, when he records this satisfaction, he should be conscious of the fact and he should be satisfied that the documents which have been seized or recovered from the searched person, that is the director of the assessee company in this case, belong to the other person, that is the assessee. In such a case, the satisfaction note would be for the other person, that is the assessee. And if that is so, the requirement of 153CA is fulfilled and there is no obligation on the officer to issue two separate satisfaction notes. Now we then move to the decision of the Bombay High Court in JSW Steel. Now this was a case where the assessee in its original return claimed a loss of around 104 crores. The case was selected for scrutiny and notice was issued under 143(2). Now while the scrutiny proceedings were pending, the search was carried out and a notice was issued under section 153A. Now pursuant to this notice under 153A, the assessee filed a return wherein he increased the claim of loss from 104 crores to 419 crores. That is, the assessee made a new claim for the first time where for treating certain gain as capital receipt. Now, because of this treatment in this return, the loss of the assessee increased substantially. Now, in the search proceedings, the officer in the order took a view that a new claim cannot be raised by the assessee at this particular stage. And when this particular loss was not claimed in the return originally filed under 139(1), the assessee does not or is not allowed to raise a fresh claim in the return filed pursuant to notice under 153A. Now the High Court observed that the second proviso to section 153A clearly says that any pending assessment or reassessment of any year falling within the block of 6 assessment years shall abate on the date of initiation of search. And therefore, once the return of income filed in terms of 153A has to be treated as a return under 139. And therefore, the original return which was filed by the assessee and the original assessment proceedings which had commenced abated due to this search which was carried on. And therefore, the original return loses its relevance and the assessee is free to file a return under 153A, making new claims, and the same has to be entertained by the assessing officer. Now we then look at the decision of Pushkar Chandra Jain, where the Bombay High Court was concerned with the issue as to what is the obligation of the person who has received certain money on which tax has been deducted, but the deductor has not deposited those monies in the bank account or with the government. So looking at the facts of this case, the petitioner in this case sold an immovable property for 9 crores. And in compliance of section 194 IA, the purchaser deducted tax at the rate of 1% and remitted the balance net amount to the assessee. However, the purchaser did not deposit this TDS, which was deducted by him, with the government. Thereafter, a notice was issued to the assessee, that is the petitioner, the seller, and his bank account was also attached because the purchaser had not deposited the tax. So the petitioner filed a writ petition with the Bombay High Court contesting that the fact that the deductor, that is the purchaser, has withheld taxes from the payments made to the seller merely because he has not deposited the taxes would not mean that the assessee is liable. The High Court quashed the recovery notice and held that under section 205 there is a bar on direct recovery of the money from the assessee. 205 says that where tax is deducted at source, the assessee shall not be called upon to pay the tax himself to the extent to which the tax has been deducted. Therefore, the High Court observed that out of 9 crores, once the tax has been deducted and the assessee has received only the net amount, the department cannot recover the TDS amount from the assessee. Bombay High Court said that if the payer does not deposit the tax which he has deducted, then the department can take coercive steps against the payer to recover the money which he has not deposited. But the assessee is at no fault, and therefore the department cannot insist on recovering this amount from the assessee seller. We then go to the decision of Ventura Textiles, where the Bombay High Court was concerned with the issue as to what is the validity of a penalty proceedings when the penalty notice does not mention the particular head under which the penalty has been initiated. Now, this was a case where the assessee claimed certain deduction as bad debts. Subsequently, the assessee, during the assessment proceedings, it was found that the assessee had paid certain compensation for supply of inferior quality of goods, and therefore the amount claimed as bad debts was not correct. So the assessee took an argument before the officer that even if it is not in the nature of bad debts, it should be still allowed as a deduction under 37. The officer in the quantum proceedings rejected the claim of the assessee and denied deduction under 36(1)(7) as well as under 37. The assessing officer in the assessment order stated that the assessee had furnished inaccurate particulars of income and therefore ordered initiation of penalty proceedings under 271(1)(c). So this is an important fact to be noted, that the assessment order did mention that the assessee had furnished inaccurate particulars, and because of that reason, the officer had initiated the penalty. But when the penalty notice was issued on the very same day, the assessing officer did not strike off the notice and did not specify that the notice was in relation to furnishing inaccurate particulars. So before the High Court, the contention of the assessee was that the penalty proceedings would fall because the notice has to specify as to whether the penalty has been charged for concealment or for furnishing inaccurate particulars. High Court rejected this argument of the assessee. The High Court said that the purpose of the notice is to make the assessee aware about the grounds on which the notice has been issued. And it is very clear from the assessment order that the penalty was initiated for furnishing inaccurate particulars of income. And once the assessment order is clear to that effect, the assessee is aware about the basis on which penalty is issued, and therefore there is no requirement that the show cause notice, which is issued on the very same day, should also specify that the penalty has been for a particular head. So therefore the High Court, rejecting this argument, said that the fact that the assessment order is clear, it would be a very technical view that only because the penalty notice the officer has not struck off the inapplicable portion, it cannot be said that the entire proceedings would fail. This is an important principle which has been laid down by the Bombay High Court. We then look at the Supreme Court's decision in the case of Shiv Shakti. Now, this was a case where the appeals before the Supreme Court related to assessment years 97-98 to 2000-2001. Now, all the issues in this appeals before the Supreme Court was the same as that in assessment year 1-2 in the assessee's own case where the High Court had held in assessee's favor. Now, the High Court, when it took a favorable view in assessment year 1-2, the department did not further challenge that High Court's order to the Supreme Court and accepted the position. So when the appeals for these other years came up before the Supreme Court held that once the High Court's decision in the assessee's own case for the other year has become final and was not challenged by the department in the Supreme Court, the view taken therein will apply to the current years as well. And consequently, the reassessment which was initiated for these assessment years 97-98 to 2000-2001 were struck down. Then look at the decision of the Bombay High Court in Bhavya Construction Company. Now, this was a case where the assessee company was aggrieved by the decision of the tribunal on several counts. The assessee stated that the decision of the tribunal was in breach of principles of natural justice because the assessee had relied on several decisions which were not dealt with by the tribunal at all, and no reasons were given by the tribunal as to how those decisions were inapplicable to the facts of the assessee. Secondly, the tribunal in its decision relied on several decisions which were not even cited by the assessee nor by the department during the hearing. So, reliance on these decisions by the tribunal was a complete surprise to the assessee, and there was no occasion for the assessee to challenge or to any way convince the tribunal that those decisions were distinguishable and had no effect to the facts of the case. And therefore, the prayer of the assessee before the Bombay High Court was that the manner in which the tribunal had disposed of its appeal was clearly in breach of principles of natural justice, and the assessee was aggrieved by the manner in which it was done. So the High Court, looking at the manner in which the tribunal had disposed of this appeal, set aside the order of the tribunal for fresh hearing in accordance with the law. Thank you very much for patient hearing.
Thank you, Harsh. It was an excellent session, Harsh. Before there are certain announcement. Harsh, we have two questions. You are on mute, Harsh.
The first question is, if a particular clause in the DTAA is not available, then is required to follow income tax provisions.
Means in case where there are no clauses which are applicable to DTAA, so the normal income tax provision will prevail.
Right. So, as per section 90, it has the option to go as per the act or the provisions of the treaty, whichever are beneficial to the assessee. There is no, if the treaty does not in any way contain any provisions to that effect, then the assessee has no choice but to go as per the provisions of the Act. The second
Okay.
question is whether CSR is allowable expense in income tax, and if yes, in which particular section. So the CSR expenditure is not allowable. A clear provision is there to that effect. But the decision in the case which we looked at was what is the position where the CSR expenditure is also claimed as a deduction under ATG. That was the basis of the claim that the CSR expenditure was eligible for deduction or under ATG.
Okay. Thank you, Ash. It was a nice session. Before I request Vijayji to present vote of thanks, there is one announcement for the members. Considering this COVID-19 impact and COVID-19 situation, BCSE has organized a seminar on issues and impact in accounting and auditing due to COVID-19 on 14th August at 5 p.m. Request member to do register and join for the session. Now I would request CA, our past convener, CA Vijay Kumar Jain to present heartily vote of thanks to today's speaker.
Yeah. Good evening, members. It's my pleasant task to propose a well-deserved vote of thanks to our Speaker Harsh Kotari, who has dealt the recent case laws in a most simple and efficient manner. He has dealt the various case laws relating to High Court and Supreme Court with respect to the subject of TDS, assessment procedure, search, seizure, capital gains, penalties, etc. Sir, we are indeed thankful to you for accepting our invitation. Your presentation was wonderful. We also thank you for your valuable time so that we can get maximum benefit of your experience and also for answering all the queries raised by the members. On behalf of BCSE, I propose a well-deserved vote of thanks and request the member to carry out with a loud applause. Thank you. And we will meet on 14th of August at 5 p.m. Till then, it's bye from team BCSE and Vijay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Harsh.
Thank you.